Welcome back, friends, to the second half of Economic Update. As we often do in this second half, I am very pleased to introduce to you my guest for today. The introduction will be brief, not because of any lack of material. It's in the opposite problem. There's too much. My guest is Chris Hedges. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning former reporter for the New York Times. He's the author of Wages of Rebellion, The Moral Imperative of Revolt. He is a speaker who crisscrosses both the United States and Canada and also is busy abroad. I bump into him from time to time. I've had the good fortune to do a few things together with him in recent years. So it is an enormous personal pleasure as well as a treat, I believe, for all of you to have a conversation with him about what's going on here in the United States and beyond that in the world. So welcome to our program, Chris.
Thanks, Rick.
All right, let me jump right into it, given what this program does, and ask you, where in the broader picture of what you see going on in the United States and beyond is the problem of the economic system, what we talk about on this program? I thought my viewers and listeners would enjoy how it looks from another perspective, from yours. You have broad interests, but in that, the capitalist system and its ways figure, and I'd like to hear you say a few things about it.
Well, since I've been tutored by your work, I think that Marx got it, that we're in the twilight stage of capitalism when, as Marx predicted, what capitalism does is essentially not only become parasitic, but cannibalistic. So you've deindustrialized the country, you've thrust, and we know the figures, the official figures of unemployment, of poverty are fixed. You've impoverished the country, deindustrialized the country, stripped social services, and you have large corporations essentially consuming the very machinery that sustains the state. And the whole notion of the common good, of the commons, of any kind of government as a structure to foster and maintain community has been jettisoned by neoliberalism. And so you were watching in the Trump administration this extreme kleptocracy. And I'm not speaking about just the personal kleptocracy of Trump and his family, which is extreme, but the kleptocracy of corporations and hedge funds that seek to extract money. The education department, we spend about $800 billion a year on education. We have placed a lobbyist, Betsy DeVos, who has never even wasn't educated in the, essentially, who has this mantra that we're going to destroy public education and make it better. And they want that money. And they're getting it through charter schools, which we know do not perform in states like Michigan, where DeVos's foundation has set up numerous for-profit charter schools. We know it doesn't function better. We know it's a form of educational apartheid in the sense that they will refuse to accept not only poor students, students of color, but students with learning disabilities, students for whom English is a second language because they're more expensive to educate. They have a kind of for-profit model. They're completely vocational. They destroy teachers' unions. They bring in people who are ill-equipped to teach and essentially teach by rote. And this is just writ large now. So you have her brother, of all people, Eric Prince, attempting to privatize the war in Afghanistan. You have Bose Allen Hamilton, which gets 99% of its revenue from the federal government by privatizing intelligence, which, of course, where Edward Snowden came from. Right. And that fusion, by the way, of corporate access to all of our personal information and government access to all of our information. We have 16 roughly intelligence agencies, and 70 or more percent of its work is done by private contractors. So that's the stage that we're in. You see in distressed cities, Detroit would be an extreme example, but any city really, where they are selling off their municipal assets, their sewers, their parking authority, anything, to try and pay back usury loans at high interest rates that they have had to take out of Wall Street, especially after 2008, in order to continue to have the city function. The main institutions left in most American cities, when they have them, are universities and hospitals. So I would say that presages a very frightening scenario, because not only is it not sustainable, but eventually it will lead to systems collapse. And I'm talking about the inability of urban areas to collect the garbage. People can't pay their property taxes. So we're
Detroit, they couldn't pay for the water.
Right, and so they do a hostile takeover, and they bring in somebody who poisons the families, including the children of the city, pumping toxic water out of the Detroit River because they don't want to purify it. I mean, that's I think Detroit is an extreme example of where we're heading.
All right, let me push this. One of the symptoms of the capitalism, at least as it's developing here in the United States, is well known. It's the growing gap between rich and poor. It's been underway at least 30 to 40 years, a kind of rollback of what happened out of the Depression and the war. Here's the question that I think is on millions of American people's mind. How much further can this go before it reaches some point of intolerability, so that people, or is that the wrong question to ask? In other words, this very stage, as you put it, of a capitalist decay or decline, has with it the conditions that you might expect provokes a resistance. Do you see that? Or is it a wrong question?
No, and the elites are acutely aware of that, which is why they have militarized police forces, handing military-grade equipment, including tanks we saw on the streets of Ferguson, 50 caliber machine guns. Most of these cops don't even know how to use these weapons. And the wholesale surveillance, which is a characteristic of any totalitarian society. As Hannah Arendt writes, you collect information on all of the citizenry not to seek a crime, but when you want to criminalize a person or a segment of the society, you have information by which you can use in order to justify, even though it's innocuous. So the elites are well aware that there's blowback. What I worry is that with the complete collapse of the left in the United States, unlike in Europe, where there are kind of residual pockets, still communist, socialist entities, certainly atrophied, but ours were just destroyed in the name of kind of the war against communism. If there are anarchic uprisings, which I think there will be, then without vision, and without a national kind of focus, i.e., I think your case and mine, that would be a kind of socialism, then they're easily quelled because they can be dealt with as individual brush fires across the landscape. And certainly all the tools of the state or the mechanisms that the state has accrued to itself, and we're not just talking about the physical mechanisms of wholesale surveillance and massive homeland security. These groups are all infiltrated and monitored, but also the legal mechanisms, the ability to deny people habeas corpus. We see in marginal communities where people of color live, mini police states where they have no right to due process. I teach in the prison system in New Jersey. My students never got a trial, and in fact, the ones who were usually didn't do the crime, many of them didn't do the crime, and as you said, many of them in there for drugs. Well, most of them are in there because they're poor and black. If they go to trial, then the way they force you to plea out is by stacking you with 15, 20 charges, most of which you didn't commit, including major charges like kidnapping, which has a 25-year sentence, and then saying, well, we'll remove this, we'll remove that, and you can go to prison for 11 years or whatever, 15. These sentences are quite long often. But if they go to trial, then they get all the charges. The public defender is not going to spend more than 10 or 15 minutes with them. I mean, I've taught people in prison. I taught one guy who had life plus 154 years. He never committed a violent crime. It was all weapons, possessions, and drug charges. That's not uncommon. And so they use those people as kind of poster children and say, well, look what happened to them. You don't want to go to trial. So 94% roughly of the people in our prison system never got a trial. Then you've got all the SWAT teams that can kick down doors. These people are going for nonviolent drug offenses, terrorizing people in the middle of the night. You've got, it's far worse than stop and frisk, racial profiling. As you know, I sued President Obama over Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act, which overturns the 1878 Posse Comitatus Act that prohibits the military from acting as a domestic police force. We won the case in the Southern District Court of New York. The Obama administration immediately appealed. It went to the Second Circuit. The Second Circuit wouldn't rule because it's so patently unconstitutional. And what they did is they used another case. I was part of the case against Clapper versus Amnesty International on wholesale surveillance, was the Supreme Court said we didn't have a right to bring the case. So the Second Circuit said, well, he doesn't have Hedges. It was Hedges versus Obama. He doesn't have a right to bring the case. In that case, he doesn't have standing, and so therefore he doesn't have standing. And so they never ruled. They just threw it out, and we filed a cert or petition to the Supreme Court. They wouldn't take it. It's now law. So they have the mechanism now to deploy the military in the streets of American cities, to seize American citizens who they deem to be terrorists, strip them of due process, and hold them indefinitely in military detention centers. That's law. And we saw what happened to 110,000 Japanese Americans during World War II. In fact, Judge Catherine B. Forrest, in her opinion, cited that internment of Japanese Americans as now being legal. So the legal and the physical mechanisms are there. And again...
But in effect, you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the folks who run this society, they kind of know that they're pushing against the potential for a real blowback and are therefore taking these steps almost in preparation.
Completely.
The very thing I said in the first half, we don't prepare for the storm, this is a storm they are preparing for.
Yeah, and the Pentagon's preparing for climate change. They've issued numerous reports. Even the head of the CIA, Woolsey, wrote a long report, I think it was 2003, talking about not only mass migrations, but mass migrations from the coast of Florida. I mean, they have to live in the real world if they want to retain power. So they know very well what's coming, and they're ready. Unfortunately, we live in a society utterly awash in electronic hallucinations, Derek Jensen calls them. We're awash in lies. And the corporate press, you can see it, you mentioned it in the first half of your show, but the coverage of the devastation in Houston and Florida. What was it? It was feel-good stories about heroic rescues or dramatic photos of flooded streets or but not a word about climate change. These are patterns of, because we have disrupted the climate, these are going to become, Houston will get hit again. Florida will get hit again. We know this. That's climate scientists have
They expect Jose, the one that's already building, to do it again?
Right, model after model. We know what's coming. But the corporations, in particular the fossil fuel industry, and we can't let the animal agriculture industry off the hook, they have a lock on systems of public information and public education. So yes, they know what's coming. Yes, they are preparing, both legally and physically. And I think what's most ominous is that when you walk into marginal communities where poor people of color live, that is their practice space. And should there be unrest outside of those communities? I mean, mass incarceration, which is obscene in this country, 2.3 million people, almost all poor people of color, although the poor whites are increasingly